The boy who listened more than he spoke. Sometimes the quietest voice in the room is the one that's writing history. The city of Chennai, tucked away in the vibrant heart of southern India, bustled with a rhythm that was uniquely its own. Narrow lanes woven between pastel-colored buildings, the hum of early morning street vendors preparing tea, the subtle clang of temple bells mingling with the rising sun. This was home to Sundar Pichai. Long before he walked into boardrooms filled with billionaires, before he became the name behind one of the most powerful tech companies in the world, Sundar was just a boy. A boy who observed, absorbed, and asked questions, not always aloud, but always inwardly, always with curiosity. The humble beginnings. Sundar grew up in a 2-room apartment in Ashok. It wasn't small because it had less. It was small because it was full of dreams, books, and warmth. His father, Sundar Pichai, was an electrical engineer who worked for the British conglomerate GEC. His mother, Lakshmi, was a stenographer who paused her career to raise her children. They didn't have a car. They didn't even have a telephone for years. But what they had was something more valuable than material wealth: unwavering support for their children's education. Even as a child, Sundar was different. While other children were boisterous, shouting over each other, Sundar was quiet. But his silence was never empty. It was filled with thought. He'd sit for hours examining objects around him. He had a particular fascination with the rotary dial telephone. When they finally got one in the house, it wasn't just a communication device to him. It was a puzzle, a marvel of engineering. He memorized every number his family dialed. It wasn't a game. It was a window into understanding the patterns of people, the connections between actions and outcomes. This unusual memory would later serve him in unexpected ways. School days, the quiet storm. At school, Sundar's teachers were often conflicted about him. He wasn't loud or aggressive, which sometimes caused him to fade into the background. But when called upon, he answered with clarity that made even the teachers pause. "There's something in that boy," his science teacher once said. "He doesn't need to speak often. When he does, it's always worth listening." His classmates didn't always understand him. He wasn't the center of attention. He wasn't the class clown. But when exam results came, Sundar's name was always at the top. Quietly, consistently, he became the boy everyone respected, even if they didn't quite understand why. One particular incident during a state-level science competition stood out. His team was tasked with designing a system that could conserve household energy. Most teams brought elaborate prototypes, flashy posters, and even battery-operated displays. Sundar brought a diagram, a handwritten report, and a functional model made from salvaged parts of old radios and fans. No LEDs, no music, no theatrics, just a model that worked. The judges were skeptical at first, until they saw the efficiency of his design. "Where did you learn this?" they asked. "My father," Sundar replied simply, and a little curiosity. They gave him first place, but more importantly, they gave him confidence, the bridge to somewhere bigger. As Sundar grew, so did his hunger for knowledge. He earned a seat at the Indian Institute of Technology in Kharagpur, one of the most prestigious institutions in India. It was his first time leaving his hometown, his first taste of a broader world. At IIT, the competition was fierce. The smartest students from every corner of the country gathered there, each one as bright as the next. But once again, Sundar's strength wasn't in being the loudest, it was in being the most persistent. He didn't just solve problems, he broke them down, turned them around, and found better ways to solve them. When others saw a challenge, he saw a question. Not "how can I beat this?" but "why does this work this way?" His professors took notice. One even wrote a recommendation letter that later helped Sundar secure a scholarship to Stanford University. But before that, he had a moment of pause. Sundar's family could not afford the airfare to the United States. The dream was right there, acceptance from Stanford in hand, but reality was knocking hard. It took all of his father's savings and a loan from friends to fund the journey. His parents let him go with hope in their hearts and tears in their eyes. Sundar arrived in California with little more than a backpack and a belief that knowledge could change the world. A world too big, a mind too focused. America was a culture shock. The buildings were taller, the roads wider, the people louder. For a boy raised in a small apartment without a refrigerator, the abundance was overwhelming. He missed home. He missed the smell of cardamom in the morning tea, the bustle of Chennai markets, the comfort of Tamil. But he pressed on. At Stanford, he studied material sciences and semiconductor physics. It wasn't glamorous, but he loved it. To him, every atom told a story. Every formula was a conversation. He didn't care about fame or money. He cared about building, solving, understanding. After his master's, he moved on to Wharton for an MBA. He was hesitant. It wasn't engineering. But he soon learned that leadership wasn't just about knowing the answer. It was about asking the right questions and listening well. His peers noticed something else about him. Something unusual in business school. He didn't speak just to be heard. He spoke when it mattered. And when he did, people listened. The job that didn't seem big. At first, when Sundar joined Google in 2004, it was not a dream job. In fact, he was more interested in working on real products that touched users, not just theoretical designs. Google seemed promising but unpredictable. His first project, the Google Toolbar. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't even Google's core business. But Sundar threw himself into it. He realized the toolbar gave Google more visibility on Internet Explorer, a browser controlled by Microsoft. It also allowed users to search directly from any web page. In other words, it was a backdoor to users' attention. While others dismissed it as minor, Sundar saw the future. Then came the day when Microsoft made Bing the default search engine on Internet Explorer. Panic spread in the company. Sundar didn't panic. He pitched an idea. Google needed to build its own browser. It was bold, radical, even. Google wasn't a browser company. But Sundar made his case quietly, methodically, with data. Not hype. Just clarity. The result? Google Chrome. The browser that would go on to dominate the market. That would change the way billions accessed the web. And Sundar, he wasn't just building tools. He was shaping the way the world connected. The man who whispered ideas that roared. There was something almost paradoxical about Sundar Pichai as he rose through the ranks at Google. In an environment that often prized bold declarations, fast-talking innovation pitches, and a culture of overconfidence, he remained composed, unshaken, analytical, and precise. He wasn't the type to interrupt in meetings or dominate a room with charisma. Instead, Sundar built his influence like he built technology, layer by layer, purposefully and silently powerful. While many chased attention, he chased ideas. While others competed to speak first, he mastered the art of listening. Following the success of the Google Toolbar and the vision he planted for Chrome, Sundar earned the trust of the leadership. Yet even then, he was not drawn to the spotlight. When Chrome launched in 2008, it was met with both curiosity and skepticism. The browser market was already established with Internet Explorer and Firefox commanding the terrain. But Sundar wasn't focused on immediate market share. He believed in fundamentals, faster loading times, a minimalist interface, security, and efficiency. He knew users didn't want browsers to think for them. They wanted them to disappear in the background, silently enabling experiences. Chrome did just that. It didn't shout, it simply worked. And in that, it mirrored Sundar himself. As Chrome gained traction and eventually overtook other browsers in global market share, Sundar's name quietly started to echo in the upper corridors of Google's Mountain View headquarters. His leadership style became something of a quiet marvel. While others in the industry made headlines for bold opinions and public confrontations, Sundar was known for something far rarer: his ability to unite. He was the one in the room who diffused tension with a simple, "Let's take a step back." He had a way of listening to all sides, synthesizing opinions, and delivering a conclusion that made everyone feel heard. It wasn't just intellect, it was emotional intelligence woven into every decision. But his ascent wasn't without challenges. The tech world is rife with egos, competition, and fast-moving pieces. As Google expanded its product line, Gmail, Maps, Docs, Android, the complexity of decision-making grew. Sundar was pulled into projects far beyond Chrome. At every turn, he brought the same clarity, focus, and curiosity that had defined his earlier years. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but he was often the most impactful. Engineers loved working with him because he understood their language. Executives trusted him because he was consistent, measured, and reliable. To the outside world, he was still largely unknown. But inside Google, he had become the quiet force holding things together. One of the pivotal moments came when Sundar took on the leadership of Android, following the departure of Andy Rubin. Android was the most widely used mobile operating system in the world, but it was also facing intense pressure. Fragmentation, competition with Apple's iOS, and hardware integration challenges loomed large. Sundar, now responsible for both Chrome and Android, approached the task not as a conqueror, but as a steward. He didn't come in trying to undo what was built. He came in to elevate it. He started by streamlining internal communication. Under his guidance, Android began aligning more closely with other Google products. He emphasized user experience across platforms, nudging teams to think not in silos but in ecosystems. He also deepened relationships with OEM partners, speaking not just from a position of power, but from one of collaboration. Where others might have dictated, he engaged. Where others would command, he persuaded. He didn't need to be feared to be respected. His strength was in his reason. And still, Sundar remained unchanged in demeanor. He wore the same calm smile, asked the same thoughtful questions, and arrived early to the same meetings where he listened more than he spoke. His background as an engineer made him uniquely credible to technical teams, but his temperament made him invaluable to executives. Slowly, he became the connective tissue of Google, bridging strategy and product, ambition and feasibility, vision and execution. It was around this time that people within the company began to talk, not about Sundar's accomplishments, but about his presence. "He makes things feel solvable," one colleague remarked. Another said, "When he walks into a room, the temperature drops. Not because he's cold, but because chaos disappears." That's what Sundar had become, a force of stability in an industry built on constant disruption. Outside the Googleplex, the tech world was shifting rapidly. New startups were rising, voice assistants were emerging, cloud computing was becoming central, and regulatory scrutiny was increasing. Google needed not just a visionary, but a leader who could steer the company through complexity with composure. Larry Page, who had co-founded Google and served as CEO, was ready to step back and focus on broader ambitions under Alphabet, the newly formed parent company. The search began for someone who could take the helm of Google. Many expected the role to go to someone with flash, someone with the charisma to inspire headlines and dominate stages. But inside the company, the choice was becoming increasingly obvious. It wasn't the loudest person who had held Google together during its most transformative years. It was the quiet one. The one who had no scandals, no enemies, and no hunger for fame. Just a remarkable record of trust, delivery, and unity. In August 2015, the announcement came. Sundar Pichai was named CEO of Google. There were no triumphant victory speeches, no chest-thumping declarations, just a gentle email to the company, outlining his gratitude and his hope for what they could build together. And outside the boardrooms, outside the press releases and the business news, there was a boy in Chennai who once stared at a rotary phone in fascination, who now led the company that had helped connect the world. But the real test hadn't even begun. Because becoming CEO wasn't the destination, it was the beginning of a new chapter. One where the battles were no longer about engineering problems but human ones. Ethical dilemmas, misinformation, data privacy, global responsibility. It would be here, in this next phase, that Sundar would walk into rooms filled with billionaires, world leaders, critics, and skeptics, and not only change how they viewed him, but how they viewed leadership itself. He wouldn't raise his voice. He wouldn't command the room. He would simply walk in, listen, and then, quietly, powerfully, speak. The silence that reshaped the boardroom. The first weeks after Sundar Pichai became CEO of Google were not filled with fanfare or interviews or the triumphant air that usually surrounds such ascensions in Silicon Valley. There were no gold-plated announcements or over-designed welcome ceremonies. Instead, there was work, a desk full of decisions, a world full of expectations, and a mountain of scrutiny waiting quietly, yet ominously, behind every product launch, policy debate, or executive meeting. The throne Sundar had inherited wasn't carved in glamour. It was a seat balanced delicately between global influence and endless responsibility. And he stepped into it not with bravado, but with presence, the quiet kind that doesn't seek to control the room but anchors it. Inside Google's Mountain View campus, things began to shift, though not in dramatic, cinematic fashion. Sundar didn't command sweeping changes overnight or restructure for applause. What he brought, however, was subtle yet powerful. Alignment. He would walk into a conference room, pull out a chair at the table rather than stand at the head, and simply begin by asking a question. What are we really solving here? He would say, and in that moment, the room would soften. The competition between ideas would turn into collaboration, and the fog of individual ambition would clear, revealing the shared goal underneath it all. This was Sundar's gift, not just intelligence, but clarity. He had an uncanny ability to walk into the most tangled situations, departments at odds, competing roadmaps, indecisive strategies, and with a few calm observations and a series of thoughtful inquiries, untangle the mess until what remained was a direction everyone could follow. People didn't walk out of his meetings feeling overruled. They walked out feeling seen, respected, and realigned. It wasn't long before this approach caught the attention of Google's global leadership and board members. In an era where tech companies were increasingly in the public eye for not just their innovations, but their impact on society. Data privacy, misinformation, monopolistic practices. Google needed a leader who didn't just understand products, but understood people. The tide had changed. Engineering brilliance alone was no longer enough. Now the stakes were about ethics, diplomacy, communication, and trust. And here was Sundar, soft-spoken, steady-handed, and principled, emerging not just as a CEO, but as a statesman in the making. There was a particular meeting, one that would later become a quiet legend in Google's internal circles, that encapsulated this transformation. It was held in an expansive boardroom with glass walls that reflected the California sun, its long oak table filled with some of the most powerful minds in tech and business, venture capitalists, senior executives, and Google's top board members. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The topic was complex: how to approach emerging global regulations concerning data privacy while balancing product growth in regions with differing political expectations and technological capabilities. The room, usually buzzing with energy, was unusually quiet as Sundar entered. He greeted each person with a subtle nod, took his seat without ceremony, and placed his notebook on the table. For the first 20 minutes, he said nothing. He listened, leaning slightly forward, making eye contact with each speaker, giving them the sense that their words weren't just being heard, but being deeply considered. There were divergent views being expressed, some advocating aggressive market moves, others urging restraint in the face of regulatory heat. Debates swelled, voices raised, and solutions circled the room like moths to a flame, none quite landing. Then Sundar spoke, not to contradict, not to dominate, but to clarify. "I think," he began slowly, "we've all agreed that our mission is to build helpful technology. But helpful to whom? And at what cost?" The room fell silent. He continued, laying out a vision that was neither naive nor overly idealistic. He acknowledged the complexities, how user data needed protection, how government trust had to be earned, how products had to remain useful, and how revenue models had to evolve to align with a changing world. He didn't offer a slogan or a catchphrase. He offered a map, a long-term view that balanced innovation with accountability. And then, instead of locking in his view as the final word, he looked around and said, "This isn't a decision I want to make alone. I need your thoughts not as investors or executives, but as users, as parents, as citizens." That moment didn't go viral. It wasn't quoted in Forbes or splashed across tech blogs. But inside that room, something fundamental changed. It wasn't just the way Sundar led, it was the kind of leadership he represented. He had brought humanity into a space that often prided itself on cold logic, and he had done it not with performance, but with presence. Back at headquarters, employees began to feel the ripple. Teams that once worked in isolation started cross-collaborating more naturally. Product decisions that once prioritized speed began to include deeper conversations around ethics, diversity, and sustainability. Engineers found that their designs were being reviewed not just for functionality, but for societal impact. The shift wasn't immediate, but it was irreversible. Under Sundar, Google was beginning to mature, not just as a company, but as a global citizen. What made it all the more inspiring was that Sundar never pretended to have all the answers. In fact, he often reminded his teams that not having an answer right away wasn't a flaw. It was a beginning. "Let's figure it out together," he would say, not as a motivational line, but as a working principle. And in doing so, he removed the pressure to be perfect and replaced it with the freedom to be curious. He visited teams across the globe, not as a VIP dropping in, but as a fellow problem solver. Whether it was engineers in Zurich, sales teams in Sao Paulo, or researchers in Tokyo, he carried the same notebook, asked the same grounded questions, and left behind not directives, but direction. His leadership became less about giving answers and more about shaping cultures that could build, question, and grow long after he had left the room. And yet, despite all this, Sundar remained deeply rooted in who he was. He still traveled back to India quietly, visiting his old school when he could, talking to students not as a CEO, but as someone who had once sat where they now sat, dreaming from a desk under a slow-moving fan. He spoke often about the importance of humility, not as a virtue to display, but as a tool to survive. In a world that rewards noise, he had built a life out of quiet strength. And that strength would be tested soon in ways no one could have predicted. Because beyond boardrooms and browser wars, beyond product launches and policy papers, a new world was forming. One of geopolitical fractures, generative technologies, AI ethics, and global inequality. The room was changing again. The people in it were more powerful, the stakes higher. And once again, Sundar Pichai would walk in, not to overpower it, but to transform it, with clarity, humility, and a kind of leadership the world had almost forgotten existed. When the world watched and he stood still. There comes a moment in the journey of every great leader when the world stops watching from afar and begins to stare, unblinking, from inches away. For Sundar Pichai, that moment did not arrive with applause. It did not come during a celebration of success or a triumphant unveiling of a product. No, it arrived under the most blinding light of all: scrutiny, global, governmental, and moral. It arrived in the form of hearings, criticism, and confrontation. The tech world had changed. The honeymoon of innovation was over. Now questions thundered from podiums and headlines. What are these companies really doing with our data? Are these platforms dividing society instead of uniting it? Who is accountable when algorithms amplify harm? The world, with its tangled hopes and its rising fears, turned toward the people at the helm of the most powerful technology companies. And Sundar, by then the CEO of both Google and Alphabet, was no longer a figure behind the curtain. He was front and center. And unlike many others, he didn't duck. He didn't blame. He didn't deflect with charisma or corporate spin. He stood still. The congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C., was packed. Cameras perched on every angle, politicians lined up with notepads and rehearsed outrage, the buzz of tension simmering in the air. Sundar took his seat at the witness table wearing a simple dark suit and that same composed expression he always carried, the one that looked neither defensive nor defiant, just deliberate. It wasn't the first time Silicon Valley had sent a representative to these hearings, but it was the first time someone like Sundar had sat there, ready to engage not with spectacle but with sincerity. As the questions came, some reasonable, others bordering on theatrical, Sundar remained calm. Not the kind of calm that's passive, but the kind that listens fully before responding. When one representative loudly asked why a specific image showed up on a child's iPhone search result, Sundar did not roll his eyes, nor respond with frustration. Instead, he began patiently explaining how search indexing works, how the algorithm doesn't decide in human terms, and how the company continuously refines results to prioritize helpfulness and accuracy. He spoke not like a lawyer or a PR-trained executive, but like an educator who still believed that explaining clearly could make a difference. But what made this moment remarkable wasn't just that he kept his composure. It was that he carried into that room, into that storm, a message of responsibility without arrogance. While others might have instinctively denied or minimized tech's role in misinformation, polarization, and digital addiction, Sundar acknowledged the complexity. He didn't try to oversimplify or package uncomfortable truths into digestible sound bites. Instead, he repeated a sentiment that would echo throughout his leadership. Technology must be built with deep responsibility. Those 6 words weren't written by a speechwriter. They were etched from experience. Because Sundar, unlike many of his peers, hadn't grown up in a mansion filled with computers. He had grown up in a modest home where every piece of technology was precious, where you thought twice before making a call, where a refrigerator arriving at home was a milestone. He understood, in a way many had forgotten, that technology was not about novelty. It was about necessity. It was about human life, how we communicate, learn, live, and grow. And because he carried that understanding within him, he carried the weight of these questions differently, not as attacks to be parried, but as responsibilities to be honored. What followed the hearing wasn't a wave of unearned praise or political forgiveness. The criticism continued. The headlines remained skeptical, but behind the scenes, something shifted. Leaders on Capitol Hill began to speak differently about him. "He's not evasive," one senator reportedly said. "He's thoughtful. We need more of that." And inside Google, the ripple was even more profound. Thousands of employees, many of whom had questioned their place in the company amidst rising global tensions and ethical debates, watched their CEO stand his ground not with force, but with conviction. They saw that their leader wasn't just an engineer who had risen through the ranks. He was a voice of integrity in a moment of noise. But Sundar didn't celebrate. He didn't speak of surviving the hearing or emerging victorious. He simply returned to work, not with a sigh of relief, but with an even deeper commitment. In team meetings, he urged his colleagues to think not just about what they could build, but what they should build. He pushed for transparency in AI development, fairness in advertising algorithms, and greater inclusion in product testing. He asked hard questions, not because the answers were easy, but because they were necessary. He knew that leading in a time of doubt required more than strategy. It required soul. One particular evening, long after most of the offices had emptied and the sun had dipped behind the Silicon Valley hills, Sundar sat alone reviewing a document about YouTube's content moderation policies. A team member walked in, surprised to see him there, and asked why he hadn't left yet. Sundar smiled gently and replied, "Because people around the world will see something on one of our platforms tonight, and I want to make sure it's something that helps them, not hurts them." That moment, quiet and unseen, reflected everything he stood for. Leadership not as power, but as purpose. And so, while other tech leaders raced to make headlines with moonshot ideas, Sundar stayed steady, focused not just on the next breakthrough, but on the long-term responsibility of technology. He didn't just want to build the future, he wanted to deserve it. This wasn't the kind of leadership that made for flashy magazine covers or viral sound bites. It was slower, deeper, and more enduring. It was the kind of leadership that earned trust not through slogans, but through seasons. It was the kind that didn't chase the spotlight, yet shone anyway. And all of this, the hearings, the policies, the reflection, was leading him to another moment. A new room, one filled with billionaires, visionaries, global economists, and AI pioneers. A room that didn't just demand answers, it demanded vision. And it would be in that room that Sundar Pichai would not just stand still, but reshape the very conversation of what leadership looks like in the age of intelligence. The room where futures were decided. The invitation arrived not with fanfare, but with the solemn formality that accompanies global significance. It was not the first time Sundar Pichai had been asked to sit among the world's most powerful leaders, but this time, the tone was different. The location, a high-security, invitation-only summit in Switzerland, where heads of tech giants, world governments, economists, and global policy architects gathered each year not just to discuss the future, but to design it. It was a room unlike any other, one that pulsed with influence, ambition, and occasionally, silent warfare disguised as diplomacy. Some came to protect legacies, some to showcase power, some to push boundaries. But very few came with humility. And it was into this room, set against the snow-capped mountains and the guarded gates of Davos, that Sundar Pichai stepped, not with the chest-puffed stride of a corporate conqueror, but with the quiet gait of someone who had not come to impress, but to listen, to question, and to reimagine. The hall was grand, the lighting soft, the air heavy with the weight of ideas unspoken. Around a polished table of dark walnut, billionaires reclined in suits tailored within millimeters, watches that ticked louder than their conversations. Venture capitalists, tech founders, national leaders, and AI pioneers formed a circle of brilliance so bright that it could easily blind anyone without a grounding force. Discussions had already begun, topics flowing from AI dominance, digital currencies, deep surveillance technologies, to synthetic biology. Charts flickered on embedded digital panels, and voices traded forecasts, projections, and ambitious declarations. It was not so much a discussion as it was a display of intellect, of confidence, of unspoken contests between visionaries. And then came Sundar. He entered without a team, without a speechwriter, without a retinue. Just himself, a notebook, and a calm that felt almost out of place in a room so tense with urgency and ego. Some turned to acknowledge him politely, others nodded with guarded curiosity. They all knew who he was, the man who had taken Google from a digital platform into the beating heart of the modern world. Yet many still underestimated him. He was too reserved, too measured. He did not court media or parade success, and so some mistook his restraint for softness. That would change by the end of the evening. The moderator, a former prime minister now turned global mediator, posed a question that cut to the core of the night's agenda. In an age where AI could write laws, shape economies, and even author the next generation of art and education, who decides what the future looks like? Is it governments, corporations, or code? A flurry of voices responded with passion, some with aggression. One billionaire CEO spoke of sovereign AI, how countries must build their own artificial intelligence infrastructures to protect autonomy. Another, a tech founder turned philosopher, warned of the collapse of human purpose if machines took over too much cognitive labor. There were concerns about digital colonization, ethical collapse, monopolistic behavior. Some spoke like emperors of data empires, others like prophets of post-human futures. It was intense, brilliant, and yet, somehow, missing something. Sundar remained silent, not because he was uncertain, but because he was still listening. And when the moderator turned to him at last and asked, "Mr. Pichai, you've led the company behind some of the most powerful tools in human history. What do you believe decides the future?" The room settled into a rare silence. Even the boldest leaned in slightly, curious what this quiet man, this so-called engineer in a suit, would say. Sundar closed his notebook gently and looked around the room. And then he spoke, not with a raised voice, but with a stillness that drew attention more powerfully than any shout. "I don't believe the future is something we build from code or control from corporate offices. I believe the future is something we shape by the questions we choose to ask and the values we refuse to compromise." A pause followed, not of confusion, but of processing. He continued, "We talk about AI as if it's a force of nature, unstoppable and beyond ethics. But every algorithm begins with a human intention. Every data set is a mirror of human bias. Every tool we create, whether it's a search engine or a self-driving car, doesn't just reflect our intelligence, it reflects our priorities, our empathy, or our lack of it." And then he told them a story, not about earnings or patents or growth models, but about a school in a rural Indian village where kids shared a single tablet to learn coding. How one boy, using Google Translate and YouTube, taught himself to repair bicycles and earn enough to support his family. "When we build," he said, "we're not just serving users, we're serving lives. We're deciding who gets access to opportunity, to dignity, to hope. That is not a question of market expansion, it's a question of moral direction." The room was still. The power dynamic had shifted, not through argument or domination, but through conviction. The billionaires who had come prepared to measure influence in lines of code or columns of revenue were now looking at leadership in a new way, through the lens of responsibility. And Sundar, without theatrics, had done what few could. He had reminded the most powerful people in the world that the future was not just a product, it was a promise. A promise to make the world not just more advanced, but more just. Not just smarter, but kinder. As the session ended and the attendees slowly filtered out into the chilled alpine air, the conversations were no longer about quarterly strategies or competitive positioning. They were about balance, about designing not just with innovation, but with inclusion. One executive whispered to another, "That man just reset the entire tone of the summit." And he had, not with dominance, but with direction. Sundar didn't stay for the post-session gala or the fireside photo ops. He returned to his modest hotel room, reviewed the notes from the AI Ethics Council meeting scheduled for the next day, and sent a short message to his team. "Let's keep doing the right thing, even when no one is watching." Because that, in the end, was who he had always been. From the quiet boy memorizing numbers on a rotary dial in Chennai, to the young engineer dissecting problems in a Stanford lab, to the CEO who could sit in the room where futures were decided, and not just speak truth to power, but speak softly enough that power finally listened. And still, his journey was not over, because the world was not done testing him, and history was not done needing him. The legacy built in silence. In the decades to come, people would look back at the era of rapid transformation, the age of artificial intelligence, global connectivity, and digital disruption, and ask the inevitable questions that history demands. Who were the architects of this world? Who shaped it with wisdom, and who merely accelerated it without conscience? Who led not only with their minds but with their hearts? And when they traced those lines of influence, beyond the headlines and the IPOs, beyond the viral innovations and the tech wars, they would inevitably arrive at a name that had quietly endured in the backdrop of it all. Sundar Pichai, the man who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. The years following that decisive summit at Davos were some of the most transformative in the history of technology, not only because of the tools that were invented, but because of the frameworks that guided them. As the world stood on the precipice of AI singularities, planetary data ecosystems, and immersive digital consciousness, the question shifted from "can we build it?" to "should we build it?" And in that conversation, Sundar's legacy crystallized, not as a man of reaction, but of reflection, not as a builder of empires, but a cultivator of values. What he left behind wasn't just a trillion-dollar company or a library of patents. It was a moral compass buried deep in the machine, quietly recalibrating the way humanity would walk into its own future. Under Sundar's leadership, Google did more than grow. It matured. It evolved from a search engine into a living architecture of knowledge, opportunity, and responsibility. It stopped being just a product of code and began to resemble a product of character. In every corner of the organization, from the policy halls in DC to the engineering floors in Singapore, from the campus cafes in Mountain View to mobile devices in rural Africa, a single culture began to bloom, one that respected innovation but revered its consequences, one that chased excellence, but not at the cost of ethics. Sundar did not create this shift by force. He infused it gently, through every decision he made, every standard he upheld, and every story he told about where he came from and why that still mattered. He often spoke in company meetings about his childhood, not in sentimental detail, but in precise, purposeful reflections. He would remind young developers that the world they were building for wasn't always like theirs, that not every user lived in fiber-connected cities with smart homes and voice assistants, that the mother standing in a long line to recharge her phone in a village was just as valuable as the Silicon Valley investor running 8 apps at once. Technology, he once said in a deeply moving internal video address, should never outgrow compassion. It should be our most scalable form of empathy. That message echoed far beyond Google. Universities began including case studies of his decisions in leadership programs. Nonprofits reached out to collaborate on accessibility and equity initiatives that Google had begun prioritizing. Governments that once viewed the company with suspicion began to open cautious partnerships focused on digital literacy and AI safety. But none of this was marketed aggressively. None of it came with ad campaigns or PR blitzes. That wasn't Sundar's way. Change, he believed, had to be earned. One ethical line of code, one fair algorithm, one thoughtful product at a time. His leadership also reshaped what success meant in the tech world. No longer was it defined solely by growth charts and market dominance. Under Sundar, success began to mean long-term societal trust. It meant building products that served a blind child trying to read for the first time. It meant preventing a teenager from falling down a rabbit hole of harmful misinformation. It meant protecting democracy through factual clarity. It meant giving a farmer weather updates that could save his entire crop. This was not about grandeur. It was about grace. It was about finding extraordinary meaning in the most ordinary user. Eventually, there came a time when Sundar was offered global honors, humanitarian awards, honorary doctorates, leadership accolades from world institutions. And though he accepted them with humility, he never let them anchor him. A title, he once told a room full of young graduates, is not an achievement. A life lived in service of others. That's the real reward. And when he was asked what advice he would give to the next generation of tech leaders, he offered a response that was so characteristic of him, so deeply simple and yet profound. Be the engineer of empathy. Years later, when he finally announced his decision to step away from the day-to-day leadership of Google and Alphabet, not out of exhaustion, but out of a desire to make space for new voices, new dreams, the announcement was met not with fear or chaos, but with deep collective gratitude. Employees around the world gathered in auditoriums and virtual rooms to listen to his farewell address. There were no fireworks, no theatrical gestures, just a single spotlight, a steady voice, and a man who had walked the path of greatness without ever asking to be called great. In his final words, Sundar said something that would be quoted for generations. When I first walked into this company, I came to build. When I became its leader, I came to serve. But what I hope I leave behind is not just what we've built, but how we chose to build it. With care, with courage, and with quiet conviction. After the applause faded and the cameras turned off, Sundar stepped outside, walking down the same path he had taken for years, past the trees lining the Google campus, past the young interns who looked up at him with awe, past the whispers of legacy trailing gently behind him like a breeze. And as he disappeared into the evening light, he didn't carry trophies or medals. He carried only a notebook, half filled with ideas still unfinished, dreams still unnamed. Because men like Sundar Pichai do not live for the spotlight. They live for the sunrise. They live for the next quiet question that just might change everything. They live for the world they cannot yet see, but believe in anyway. And that, in the end, is how you build a legacy, not with noise, but with a whisper that echoes across generations.